He punished me for 3 years because he trusted lies, now he regrets letting me go. Chapter 1, The End of Chains. The heavy oak doors of the manor creaked open, revealing Adrian in his tailored charcoal suit. He exuded power and control, as always, but this time, his arm was intertwined with Elaine's, her delicate smile a sharp contrast to the storm brewing inside me. 3 years. 3 years of cold stares, harsh words, and lonely nights, all because he believed her, my cousin, my so-called family. Elaine had poisoned his mind with sweet lies while I endured the punishment without ever being allowed to defend myself. Adrian's gaze swept over me, impassive, as if I were nothing more than a servant in the house. "You've learned your lesson, haven't you, Claire?" His voice was cold, calculated, and distant. I nodded, keeping my eyes low to hide the flicker of defiance that had begun to stir deep within. "Yes, Adrian. I have." Elaine's tinkling laughter filled the hall as she placed a hand on his chest. "Oh, Adrian, you're too kind to her. She still has so much to learn." I clenched my fists, the urge to scream building in my chest, but I swallowed it down. "Not yet. This wasn't the time." Adrian's next words cut like a knife. "You should take a page from Elaine's book, Claire. She's everything you're not, poised, refined, and considerate. Try to be more like her, and maybe you'll earn a place in this family again." The air grew heavy with silence. The staff in the room froze, their eyes darting between us. They were used to these moments, but this one was different. This time, I wouldn't beg or explain myself. I bowed my head slightly, letting my hair fall like a curtain to hide my expression. "Thank you for the advice, Adrian. I'll do my best." My voice was calm, almost emotionless. His brow furrowed, as if my reaction was not what he expected. But before he could say anything more, I stepped back, excusing myself. "If you'll excuse me, I have work to attend to." I turned and walked away, each step steady and deliberate, even though my heart felt like it was shattering into 1,000 pieces. The moment I reached my room, I leaned against the door and took a deep breath. "No more," I whispered to myself. "No more tears for him." From that day, I began planning my escape. Adrian might have thought I was still the same broken woman he left in the cold 3 years ago, but he was wrong. The pain he inflicted had forged a new version of me, one that no longer needed his approval. Meanwhile, Adrian's perspective. Adrian watched Claire leave the room, a strange feeling gnawing at his chest. She was different. The submissive, teary-eyed woman he had punished for years wasn't there anymore. "Adrian, don't let her fool you," Elaine said, tugging on his arm. "She's just pretending to be obedient. You've done so much for her, but she doesn't appreciate it." He nodded absent-mindedly, but his eyes lingered on the path Claire had taken. Something was off, and for the first time, doubt crept into his mind. Had he been too harsh? Or worse, had he been wrong? Little did Adrian know, the woman he believed he could control had already decided to leave. And when she did, the regret would be his alone to bear. Chapter 2, The First Step. Claire stared at the suitcase on her bed, its empty interior a silent challenge to her resolve. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to mock her hesitation. For 3 years, she had endured humiliation and pain, but tonight, the walls of this prison would no longer hold her. She reached for the wardrobe, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her few belongings. A handful of plain dresses, worn shoes, and a necklace her late mother had given her before she passed away. She clasped the necklace tightly, letting its familiar warmth steady her nerves. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. Claire knew she had to act quickly. Adrian was meticulous and controlling, and it wouldn't be long before he noticed something was amiss. She carefully packed her belongings, making sure to leave nothing behind that would give away her plans. A soft knock at the door made her heart leap. She quickly shoved the suitcase under the bed and turned toward the door, her face composed. "Come in," she called. The door creaked open to reveal Lila, one of the maids who had been kind to her during her years of punishment. Lila's eyes widened as she stepped inside and noticed Claire's pale face. Miss Claire, is everything all right? She asked in a hushed tone. Claire hesitated, then decided to trust her. Lila had always been discreet and loyal. I'm leaving tonight, Lila. I can't stay here anymore. Lila's eyes filled with concern but also a spark of determination. Good. You deserve better than this place, she said firmly. Claire blinked back tears, grateful for the support. I need your help. Can you distract the guards at the main gate for a few minutes? Lila nodded without hesitation. Leave it to me. But where will you go? Claire shook her head. I don't know yet. Anywhere but here. I just need a fresh start. Lila squeezed her hand. You've been through so much, Miss Claire. You deserve happiness. Just promise me you'll be safe. I will, Claire said, her voice resolute. As Lila slipped out of the room, Claire took a deep breath and grabbed her suitcase. She peeked out into the hallway, ensuring it was empty before stepping out. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her, but the thought of freedom kept her moving forward. Meanwhile, in Adrian's study. Adrian sat at his desk, staring at a report but unable to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to Claire. The way she had thanked him earlier, it was too calm, too indifferent. It wasn't the reaction he had expected, and it unsettled him. Adrian, are you listening? Elaine's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing by the window, her arms crossed. What is it? He asked, irritation creeping into his tone. Elaine pouted. I said, Claire is probably plotting something. You should keep a closer eye on her. Adrian frowned. She's been quiet for years. I doubt she has the energy to cause trouble. Elaine scoffed. Don't be naive, Adrian. She's just waiting for the right moment to strike back. Her words planted a seed of doubt in Adrian's mind. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out into the night. I'll check on her later, he muttered. Claire's escape. With Lila's help, Claire managed to slip past the guards unnoticed. The cool night air hit her face as she stepped out of the estate for the first time in years. She felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration as she walked down the deserted road, the suitcase heavy in her hand. The world outside felt vast and unfamiliar, but it also felt like hope. For the first time in years, she was free. But as she turned a corner, she felt a chill run down her spine. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, growing closer with every second. Claire's heart pounded as she realized the car was heading straight for her. She froze, unsure whether to run or hide, until the vehicle screeched to a halt mere feet away. The driver's door opened, and Adrian stepped out, his expression dark and unreadable. Claire, he said, his voice low and dangerous. What do you think you're doing? Chapter 3, Confrontation Under the Moonlight. Claire's pulse quickened as she locked eyes with Adrian. His towering figure was illuminated by the car's headlights, casting a shadow over her trembling frame. The night air, once cool and liberating, now felt suffocating. Adrian stepped closer, his boots crunching against the gravel. His eyes were a tempest of confusion and anger. Answer me, Claire. Where do you think you're going in the middle of the night? She tightened her grip on the suitcase, refusing to back down. I'm leaving, Adrian. I can't live like this anymore. His jaw clenched. Leaving? And where do you plan to go? You think you can survive out there without my support? Claire lifted her chin, her voice steadier than she expected. I'd rather struggle on my own than endure another day under your control. Adrian's anger flickered into something softer, concern? Regret? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. He reached for her suitcase, yanking it from her grasp. What's in here? He demanded, unzipping it without waiting for an answer. Claire flinched as her belongings spilled onto the ground, her simple dresses, worn shoes, and the cherished necklace from her mother. Adrian's gaze lingered on the necklace, and his grip on the suitcase loosened. This? He held it up, his voice quieter now. You're leaving with just this? It's all I need, Claire replied firmly. I don't need your money, your house, or your pity. Adrian's eyes darkened. Pity? Is that what you think this is? Claire took a step back, her courage unwavering. Isn't it? You've looked down on me for years, Adrian. Punished me for crimes I didn't commit. Trusted lies over the truth. I have nothing left to prove to you. His expression faltered, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. I only wanted to teach you a lesson. To make you stronger. Claire let out a bitter laugh. Stronger? You broke me, Adrian. But I've rebuilt myself without you. And now I'm leaving. Adrian's hand tightened into a fist, his knuckles turning white. I won't let you go, Claire. You belong here, with me. I belonged here 3 years ago, and you threw me away, she shot back. You don't get to decide my fate anymore. Adrian took a step closer, his voice low and pleading. Claire, don't do this. If you leave now, you'll regret it. No, Adrian, she said, her voice resolute. The only regret I have is staying as long as I did. She bent down, picking up her scattered belongings, ignoring the way his gaze bore into her. Adrian stood frozen, conflicted, as she gathered her things and turned to walk away. Claire, he called after her, his voice laced with desperation. She paused but didn't look back. Goodbye, Adrian. With those final words, she stepped into the darkness, leaving him behind in the cold glow of the headlights. Adrian's perspective. Adrian stood rooted to the spot, his chest tightening as he watched her disappear into the night. The suitcase in his hand felt heavy, not because of its weight but because of what it symbolized, her departure, her defiance, her freedom from him. For years, he had believed he was right, that his actions were justified. But now, as he stared at the empty road, a gnawing sense of regret began to claw at his heart. Elaine's voice echoed in his mind, her poisonous words fueling his decisions. Had he truly been so blind? Adrian's hand closed around the necklace he still held, its delicate chain cool against his skin. It was a small, fragile thing, yet it seemed to carry the weight of everything he had lost. I'll make this right, he murmured to himself, his voice barely audible. I have to. But deep down, he wondered if it was already too late. Chapter 4, A New Path. Claire walked briskly down the dimly lit road, the distant hum of Adrian's car fading behind her. The chill of the night nipped at her cheeks, but she didn't stop, didn't dare look back. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from the exhilaration of finally taking control of her life. The weight of the suitcase pulled at her arm, yet it felt lighter with every step she took away from the estate. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped. A distant light. After walking for what felt like hours, Claire saw a faint light in the distance. It was coming from a small diner, its neon sign flickering weakly against the dark sky. Her stomach growled, and her legs ached, but she hesitated. What if Adrian had people looking for her? What if they were already searching the nearby towns? She shook her head, brushing away the doubt. She couldn't let fear dictate her choices anymore. Adjusting her scarf to conceal her face, she stepped inside. The warm air and the smell of coffee and fried food enveloped her. A few patrons sat at the counter, their tired faces barely glancing her way. Claire chose a corner booth, placing her suitcase beside her. A waitress with a kind smile approached. What can I get you, sweetheart? Just a cup of tea, please, Claire replied softly. The waitress nodded and disappeared behind the counter. Claire leaned back, letting herself relax for the first time that night. Adrian's desperation. Meanwhile, Adrian sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He had driven aimlessly after Claire's departure, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Her words echoed in his head. You don't get to decide my fate anymore. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, frustration boiling over. How had he let things get to this point? For years, he had justified his actions, convinced himself that his harshness was for her benefit. But now, faced with the cold reality of her leaving, he couldn't deny the truth. He had failed her. Adrian picked up his phone and dialed a number. Find her, he barked as soon as the call connected. Search every road, every station, every motel. I want her back. The voice on the other end hesitated. Sir, are you sure? Maybe. Do as I say. Adrian snapped, his voice shaking. And don't let anyone harm her. He ended the call and sat back, staring out at the dark road ahead. For the first time in years, he felt powerless, and it terrified him. A chance encounter. Back at the diner, Claire sipped her tea, savoring its warmth. She was lost in thought when a voice startled her. Mind if I sit here? She looked up to see a man standing by her table, his expression friendly but curious. He was tall, with dark hair and kind eyes. He held a cup of coffee in one hand and a book in the other. Claire hesitated, unsure if she should trust a stranger. But his demeanor was unthreatening, and the diner was well lit and public. Sure, she said quietly. The man slid into the seat across from her, setting his book down. Rough night, he asked, his tone light. Claire gave a small nod, not wanting to reveal too much. You could say that. He smiled. Me too. Sometimes, it helps to talk to someone, even if they're a stranger. Claire studied him, trying to gauge his intentions. There was no judgment in his eyes, only genuine curiosity. She decided to take a chance. I've had enough of being controlled, she said simply. The man nodded, as if he understood. Then you're stronger than most. Taking that first step is the hardest. Claire tilted her head. What about you? Why are you here? He chuckled, tapping the cover of his book. Trying to figure out the next chapter of my life, I guess. For the first time in hours, Claire felt a flicker of connection. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Adrian's discovery. Back at the estate, Adrian returned to his study, pacing restlessly. His phone buzzed, and he snatched it up. We've tracked her to a small diner on Route 17, the voice on the line reported. Adrian's heart leapt and sank simultaneously. Relief that she was safe mingled with dread at what he would say to her. Don't approach her, he instructed. I'll handle it myself. As he grabbed his coat and keys, a new determination settled over him. This time, he wouldn't let her slip away, but not through force or manipulation. He needed to make her understand. Chapter 5, Confrontation at the Diner. The diner was quiet except for the faint clinking of utensils and the soft hum of the jukebox playing a nostalgic tune. Claire sat across from the stranger, his calm demeanor making her feel unexpectedly at ease. I didn't even ask your name, the man said with a gentle smile. Claire, she replied after a brief pause, her fingers tightening around her cup. Nice to meet you, Claire. I'm Nathan, he introduced himself, leaning back in the booth. You seem like someone who's carrying a lot on her shoulders. Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. I'm just trying to figure things out. Nathan nodded as if he understood. Sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. Before Claire could respond, the soft chime of the diner door opening drew her attention. The warm air shifted slightly as a familiar figure stepped inside, his imposing silhouette unmistakable. Adrian. Her heart sank. Of course, he had found her. She clenched her jaw, trying to steady her breathing. Nathan noticed the change in her expression. Do you know him? Yes, Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. Adrian's eyes scanned the room until they landed on her. His gaze hardened when he noticed Nathan sitting across from her, the casual familiarity between them setting off a spark of jealousy. He strode toward the booth, his presence commanding as always. The other patrons watched curiously, sensing the tension. Claire, Adrian said, his voice low and firm. We need to talk. Alone. Claire straightened her back, forcing herself to meet his gaze. There's nothing left to say. Nathan glanced between them, his brows furrowing. Is there a problem here? Adrian's jaw tightened as he looked at Nathan. This doesn't concern you. Nathan didn't flinch. It does if she says so. Claire placed a hand on Nathan's arm, her touch both a reassurance and a signal. It's okay, Nathan. I'll handle this. Reluctantly, Nathan nodded and stood, giving her a small, supportive smile. I'll be over there if you need anything. He walked to the counter, but his watchful eyes remained on the scene. Adrian took Nathan's vacated seat, his presence dominating the small booth. Running away in the middle of the night? That's not like you, Claire. Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. You don't know what I'm like anymore, Adrian. Or maybe you never did. His eyes softened for a moment, but the tension in his posture remained. I know I've made mistakes. Mistakes? Claire interrupted, her voice rising. You call 3 years of punishment and humiliation a mistakes? Adrian flinched, his confidence faltering. I thought I was doing what was best for you. She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. You weren't doing it for me, Adrian. You did it to control me, to mold me into someone who wouldn't question you. But I've had enough. Silence hung between them, the weight of her words sinking in. I came here to take you home, Adrian finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire shook her head, a bitter smile tugging at her lips. Home. That house stopped being my home the day you stopped trusting me. I've made my decision, Adrian. I'm leaving. Adrian's fists clenched on the table, his frustration evident. And what about us? Are you just going to throw it all away? There hasn't been an us for a long time, Claire replied, her voice steady. You made sure of that. His eyes searched hers, desperation flickering beneath his composed exterior. Claire, Stop, she said firmly, holding up a hand. You don't get to play the victim now. I've sacrificed enough for you, and I won't do it anymore. Adrian's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. For the first time, he looked truly defeated. Is there nothing I can do to make this right? He asked quietly. Claire stood, grabbing her suitcase. You can let me go. She walked toward the exit, her head held high. Nathan gave her an encouraging nod as she passed, and she offered him a faint smile in return. Adrian remained in the booth, his hands gripping the edge of the table as he watched her leave. The door closed behind her, and the faint sound of the diner's bell felt like the tolling of a final goodbye. As the cold night air embraced her, Claire felt lighter than she had in years. She didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she was free to choose her own path. Chapter 6, A New Beginning. Claire walked briskly through the quiet streets, the crisp night air brushing against her skin. Every step felt like a defiance of the past, the heavy chains that had bound her to Adrian, to expectations, now shattering with each stride. Her heart pounded, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the clarity she felt, the power of her own choice. She hadn't looked back when she left the diner, but now, as the glow of the streetlights bathed the road in a soft amber light, she allowed herself a brief moment to process what had just happened. Adrian had come for her, yes, but this time, he hadn't been the one to make the decisions. The ache of old memories, the weight of his manipulations, still lingered, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that she had made it this far without falling into the same patterns of dependence. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her thoughts. It was a text from Nathan. If you need a place to stay tonight, I can help. I know a quiet apartment nearby. It's not much, but it'll be safe. Claire paused, staring at the message. She didn't know Nathan well, but his kindness was something she hadn't encountered in a long time. He wasn't trying to save her, wasn't looking to fix her, he simply wanted to help. She hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Then, deciding that a night of safety and a fresh start might be exactly what she needed, she typed back. Thank you. I could really use a place to stay. Within minutes, Nathan's reply came. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Wait for me near the corner. Claire followed the instructions, her mind racing with possibilities. She didn't want to jump into something too quickly, but for the first time, the thought of staying in one place, of not running from her past, felt like a good decision. She arrived at the corner Nathan had mentioned, the cool breeze carrying the faint scent of rain in the air. As she waited, she noticed a small cafe across the street, its windows glowing warmly. The thought of a cup of coffee was tempting, but she didn't have the energy to go inside and risk being recognized. A few minutes later, Nathan's car pulled up. He parked and stepped out, his expression kind yet serious. "You okay?" Claire gave him a small nod. "I'm fine. Just figuring things out." Nathan smiled and motioned toward the car. "Let's get you settled in." The ride to his apartment was brief, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was more of a quiet understanding, an unspoken agreement that this wasn't about rushing into anything, just two people giving each other the space to breathe. A place of peace. Nathan's apartment was small, but cozy. It had the feel of someone who valued simplicity and peace. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and there were soft lights casting a warm glow across the room. A leather couch sat in the middle, flanked by a few potted plants, and a thick rug lay in the center. Claire sat on the couch, feeling a sense of relief as she sank into the cushions. She could hear Nathan in the other room, moving around, making tea. When he returned, he handed her a cup, the steam rising in gentle curls. "Here. Drink this. It'll help calm your nerves." "Thank you," Claire murmured, taking the cup from him. She inhaled the scent before taking a sip. The warmth spread through her, soothing the tension in her muscles. Nathan sat across from her, leaning back casually. "You're welcome. But I'm guessing you have a lot on your mind." Claire paused, her gaze drifting to the window. The night outside seemed so still, so untouched by the chaos she'd just left behind. She took another sip of tea, savoring the moment of peace. "I didn't think I'd ever leave," she confessed quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "For so long, I felt like I didn't have a choice." Nathan nodded, his eyes softening with empathy. "Adrian has a way of making people feel like they don't have any options. But you've made a brave choice, Claire. You took control of your own life." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting his words settle within her. It was true, she had chosen. It hadn't been easy, and she knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple, but it was hers to walk now. "I don't know where to go from here," she admitted. "I don't know what to do next." Nathan's gaze remained steady, and he gave a slight shrug. "One step at a time. You don't need to have it all figured out tonight. Just breathe, and let yourself heal. You'll figure out what comes next when you're ready." Claire took another sip, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in years, she felt like she could take her time. Adrian's struggle. Back at the diner, Adrian remained, lost in his thoughts, as the hours passed. The diner had long emptied out, and the staff was preparing to close, but Adrian couldn't bring himself to leave. The weight of Claire's words echoed in his mind. "You don't get to decide my fate anymore." He had tried so hard to control everything, to protect her from what he thought were the dangers of the world, but in doing so, he had pushed her away. Adrian knew he had to make things right. He couldn't just let her go, not without doing everything in his power to fix the damage he had caused. But as he sat there, alone in the quiet diner, he realized something important: he couldn't fix this by force. Claire had made her decision, and all he could do now was respect it. The thought of her moving on without him, of her finding peace and freedom, was a bitter pill to swallow. But if it meant that she would be happy, then maybe that was the price he had to pay for his mistakes. Chapter 7, Reflections and Decisions. The morning after her arrival at Nathan's apartment was quiet, almost peaceful. Claire awoke to the soft light filtering through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. The bed was simple, but it was the first time in weeks she had slept without nightmares or the lingering sense of dread that she'd never be free. She stretched, feeling the warmth of the blankets around her, and took a deep breath, savoring the stillness. The events of the previous day seemed almost surreal, like they had happened to someone else. Adrian's words, the confrontation, the finality of it all, it felt like a chapter in her life had come to an end. But as much as she tried to enjoy the quiet, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Claire pushed herself out of bed and made her way to the kitchen, where Nathan was already preparing breakfast. The scent of coffee and toast filled the air, and she couldn't help but smile. "You didn't have to do all this," Claire said softly, her voice still a little hoarse from the night before. Nathan looked up from the stove and gave her a small grin. "It's the least I could do after everything you've been through. Plus, I make a mean omelette." Claire chuckled and sat down at the small kitchen table, watching him work with ease. There was something comforting about the simplicity of the moment. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was just surviving, she was living. "You don't have to keep being nice to me, you know," Claire said, surprising herself with the honesty. She had always been the one to protect herself, to keep her emotions hidden. But here, with Nathan, something felt different. Nathan paused for a moment, looking at her with a thoughtful expression. "I'm not being nice just to help you. I'm doing it because I want to." He turned back to the stove and added a pinch of salt to the omelette. "You're not some project, Claire. You're just, you." Claire blinked, unsure of how to respond. She had spent so much of her life as someone's project, something to fix, to mold into what they wanted. The idea that someone could simply accept her, flaws and all, felt strange but comforting at the same time. The smell of food filled the kitchen, and before long, Nathan placed a plate of food in front of her. "Eat up. You'll need your strength." Claire smiled gratefully and took a bite of the omelette. It was perfect, just the right balance of soft and fluffy. "This is amazing," she said, savoring each bite. Nathan grinned. "I told you. I'm a culinary genius." As they ate in comfortable silence, Claire's mind wandered back to Adrian. She hadn't heard from him since the diner. A part of her wondered if he had truly let her go, or if he was still fighting to keep her under his control. But then, another part of her realized that it didn't matter. She wasn't his anymore. She finished her meal and stood to clear the table, but Nathan stopped her. "I've got it. Why don't you relax a bit?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. As she sat back down, she caught a glimpse of the clock on the wall. It was almost noon. Time seemed to stretch in the quiet of the apartment, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something still needed to be done. "I have to figure out what I'm going to do next," she said, breaking the silence. Nathan looked at her with understanding. "And you will. One step at a time. No rush." Claire appreciated his patience. It felt like a luxury she hadn't allowed herself in years. But still, the weight of her future lingered, pulling at her thoughts. She couldn't stay in limbo forever. "What do you think I should do?" Claire asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan paused, his expression softening as he considered the question. "I think you should take a few days to think. Don't rush into anything. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's for you. No one else. Not Adrian. Not anyone." His words resonated with her, and Claire realized he was right. For too long, her choices had been about others, about Adrian's wants, her family's expectations, society's judgment. But now, she had the chance to decide for herself. It was a terrifying thought, but also exhilarating. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted, feeling a little lost. "You start with yourself," Nathan said simply, his gaze steady. "Figure out what makes you happy. What do you want, Claire?" Claire thought for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the window. The world outside seemed so much larger than it ever had before, full of possibilities she had never allowed herself to dream about. "I want to be free," she said, her voice full of conviction. "I want to figure out who I am without anyone telling me who I should be." Nathan nodded, his smile kind. "Then you've already taken the first step." Adrian's realization. Back in the city, Adrian had spent the last few days grappling with the consequences of his actions. He hadn't heard from Claire, and the silence was deafening. His thoughts had become a tangled mess of guilt and regret, each moment spent without her feeling like an eternity. The night she had left, something inside him had cracked. He had believed that keeping her close, controlling her, was the best way to protect her. But now, as he sat in his office, surrounded by the cold, sterile walls of the life he had built, he realized how wrong he had been. He had pushed her to the brink, and now, she was gone. Adrian's phone buzzed, breaking his thoughts. It was a message from Grace. "Where is Claire? I've tried calling her, but she's not answering. Is she okay?" He stared at the message, his throat tightening. He had no answers to give her. Grace's next message came through quickly. "Adrian, she's not answering my calls. Why aren't you doing anything about it?" His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to reply. His mind raced. What if she had truly left him for good? What if this was his final chance to make things right? But the truth was, Adrian didn't know how to fix it. He had never learned how to give her the space she needed, the respect she deserved. He had only known how to demand, to control. And now, it was too late. Chapter 8, Crossroads and Confrontation. The days passed slowly, yet each moment felt like an eternity for both Claire and Adrian. For Claire, every decision seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders as she adjusted to the new reality she had chosen for herself. Nathan's apartment had become her sanctuary, a place where she could start over, but the thought of the future, of what came next, was both exhilarating and terrifying. Claire had spent her days reflecting on her past, on everything that had led to this moment. She had allowed herself time to breathe, to heal, to rediscover who she was outside the constraints of Adrian's shadow. It wasn't easy. Every now and then, memories of Adrian's sharp words, his controlling actions, and the unbearable silence between them would creep into her thoughts, but she pushed them aside, determined not to let the past dictate her future. Nathan had been her anchor through it all, offering gentle support without pushing her to make any rash decisions. He understood the need for space, for time to process. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Claire sat in the living room, a mug of tea in her hands, staring out the window. Her phone buzzed on the table in front of her, jolting her from her reverie. It was a message from an unknown number. "Claire, it's Adrian. We need to talk." Her heart skipped a beat. The old, familiar ache stirred within her chest as she read the words. Adrian's name. She hadn't heard from him in over a week, and though she had braced herself for this moment, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Still, she knew she couldn't avoid this conversation forever. With a deep breath, she typed her response. "I'm not sure there's anything left to talk about." She hit send, and immediately regretted it. The words were sharp, almost cold, but they were the truth. She wasn't sure what else could be said between them, or if she was even capable of forgiving him. The reply came almost instantly. "Please, Claire. I've been thinking about everything. I made a mistake, and I need to make things right." Her fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to believe him, she really did. But how could she? How could she trust the man who had betrayed her in so many ways? The man who had punished her, controlled her, and, most of all, lied to her for so long. Claire set the phone down on the table and sighed. She could feel her heart battling with her mind. A part of her wanted to hear him out, to give him one last chance to explain himself, but another part of her was resolute. The person she had been with Adrian was gone. She had learned too much about herself, about what she needed, to fall back into that cycle of pain. But the moment her phone buzzed again, she couldn't ignore it. Adrian's name, once so familiar, now felt like a ghost. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Claire. But please, just give me a chance. I need you to understand what I've learned." Claire bit her lip, looking at the phone for a long moment. Her thoughts were scattered, torn between anger and the glimmer of hope that perhaps he had changed, perhaps he had truly learned something from this. But the trust she had once placed in him was shattered, and the idea of going back seemed impossible. Nathan, sensing her internal conflict, walked into the living room, holding a notebook in his hand. He sat beside her on the couch, glancing at the phone. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Claire let out a slow exhale, her eyes not leaving the phone screen. "It's Adrian. He wants to talk. He's been sending me messages for days." Nathan nodded, understanding the weight of the situation. And what do you want to do? She paused, looking down at the mug in her hands. She wasn't sure. I don't know. Part of me still feels like I owe him an explanation. Or maybe I just need to know that he understands what he did. Nathan placed a hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. You don't owe him anything, Claire. Not anymore. You've been through enough. You need to do what's best for you now, not for him. His words hit her like a punch to the gut. As much as she hated it, Nathan was right. She had spent too much of her life trying to fix Adrian's mistakes, trying to make him happy, trying to be the person he wanted her to be. But now, for the first time in a long while, she was allowed to be selfish. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a call. Adrian. Claire's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt the familiar rush of anxiety, but she knew this moment was inevitable. Taking one last look at Nathan, who gave her a small nod, Claire answered the call. Claire, Adrian's voice was soft, tentative. I know this isn't easy, and I'm not asking for your forgiveness. But I need to tell you something. Please, just hear me out. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. What is it, Adrian? I've been selfish. I've been blind to everything that you needed. I pushed you away because I was too afraid to face the truth about myself. I thought that if I controlled you, if I kept you close, it would make things better. But I see now how wrong I was. You weren't a possession. You were a person, and I never gave you the respect you deserved. Claire felt the tears threaten to spill, but she held them back. I can't just forget everything, Adrian. You hurt me. You tore me down. And I don't know if I can ever trust you again. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Adrian spoke again, his voice was filled with raw emotion. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, Claire. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Claire squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the weight of his words, but there was a hollow feeling deep inside her. She wasn't sure if it was too late for him to fix things. She wasn't sure if he could ever truly make it right. Goodbye, Adrian, she said, her voice steady yet laced with sadness. Before he could reply, she ended the call. The decision had been made. It was over. As the silence hung in the air, Claire let out a shaky breath, feeling the weight of her choice. She had let go, and now it was time to move forward. Nathan, who had been quietly watching, spoke softly. You did the right thing, Claire. It's not easy, but you're stronger than you think. Claire nodded, her gaze steady. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. The road ahead was hers to walk alone, but she would be okay. Chapter 9, The Weight of Freedom. The days that followed the phone call were some of the most quiet Claire had experienced in a long time. It was as if the world had shifted slightly, the tension from the past finally loosening its grip around her chest. For the first time in months, Claire felt like she was breathing again, free of the suffocating weight that Adrian's presence had imposed on her life. She had come to terms with the fact that letting go of him wasn't just an emotional act, but an act of survival. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of someone who never truly saw her, who had taken her love for granted. And as much as it hurt, as much as it would always hurt, she knew she had made the right decision. However, even in this newfound freedom, the silence was deafening. Her apartment, though small, had become a refuge, a space where she could finally reclaim herself. But in this sanctuary, the absence of Adrian's influence felt like an echo, a constant reminder of the years lost. Nathan had remained her steady presence, always understanding, never pushing. He had become her confidant, someone who didn't ask questions but simply listened. It was comforting, knowing she didn't have to explain everything. Nathan already understood her pain without needing every detail. One afternoon, Claire sat by the window, a book open in her lap, but her mind wandered. The thought of Adrian lingered, even though she had tried to push him away. She wondered how he was handling her departure. She wondered if he truly understood the depth of what he had lost. But more than that, she wondered what she was going to do next. She had taken control, but now the question was, what now? The soft click of the door opening startled Claire from her thoughts. Nathan stepped inside, a smile tugging at his lips. His presence was a welcome distraction, and Claire immediately found herself smiling, albeit faintly. Nathan had that effect on her. His calmness, his quiet strength, it made her feel safe. "I've been thinking," Nathan said as he set down his bag, his gaze never leaving hers. Claire raised an eyebrow. "About?" Nathan sat down beside her, his smile a bit more serious now. "You've been through so much, Claire. But now, it's time for you to start thinking about you. What do you want? What's next for you?" The question was simple, yet it sent a ripple of uncertainty through Claire's chest. She hadn't thought about it like that. In the past, her decisions had always been intertwined with Adrian's desires, his needs, his expectations. Now, she was forced to make a decision for herself, and it felt both liberating and terrifying at the same time. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so much time focusing on what Adrian needed that I forgot about myself." She paused, her fingers absently tracing the edge of the book in her lap. "I don't know who I am without him. What I want without him." Nathan's eyes softened, and he placed a hand over hers, grounding her. "That's okay, Claire. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You've been through a lot. You need time to figure it out. But you don't have to do it alone. I'm here for you." His words were like a balm to her weary soul. There was a warmth in his presence that had been missing from her life for so long. She looked up at him, and for the first time in a while, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more, something not defined by the toxic pull of Adrian's manipulation. "Thank you," she said softly, the words more meaningful than she realized. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Nathan smiled, his eyes shining with something deeper, something Claire wasn't quite sure of yet. But for now, it didn't matter. What mattered was that, in this moment, she wasn't alone. Later that evening, as they sat in comfortable silence, Claire received a message. She recognized the number immediately. It was from Adrian. "Claire, I respect your decision, but I want you to know that I haven't given up on us. If you ever change your mind, I'll be waiting." Her heart clenched at the words, the familiar mix of anger and sorrow washing over her. Adrian's message was exactly what she expected, an attempt to cling to the past, to rewrite their story, as if she could simply pick up where they had left off. Claire stared at the screen for a long moment, the words floating in front of her like a bitter reminder. Adrian hadn't changed. He still thought he could control the narrative, still thought he could pull her back into his world. But this time, she wouldn't fall for it. She set the phone down, her mind already made up. "I don't need him, Nathan," she said, her voice steady, her resolve clear. "I've already given him too much of me. I'm done." Nathan didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. His presence, his unwavering support, spoke louder than words ever could. The weight in Claire's chest felt a little lighter now, the burden of her past slipping further and further away. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments when she'd doubt herself, when she'd wonder if she made the right choice. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was making decisions based on her own desires, not anyone else's. And for the first time in forever, she felt free. Chapter 10, Unraveling the Past. The days passed slowly, each one blurring into the next, but there was a growing sense of quiet strength in Claire. She had started to piece together her life, bit by bit. Every morning, she went for long walks, grounding herself in the simple act of moving through the world without the weight of Adrian's demands. With every step, she felt herself growing, stronger, more independent, and slowly, she began to understand what Nathan had meant when he told her to think about herself. She started small. Simple pleasures she had once neglected in her relationship with Adrian. Reading books she had abandoned. Picking up an old hobby she'd loved as a child, painting. It was in these moments, as she dabbed brushstrokes of color onto canvas, that Claire felt a sense of clarity, as if the colors themselves were brushing away the fog that had clouded her vision for so long. Nathan nodded, his expression understanding. "It's a lot to process," he said softly. "But you'll figure it out, Claire. You've already come so far. You don't have to have it all figured out right now." Claire let out a breath, grateful for his patience. The pressure of having to fix everything right away had been something she had placed on herself for so long. Nathan, however, always seemed to understand that healing didn't happen on a schedule. "I know," she whispered, "but I feel like I should have something to show for all this pain. Like I should know exactly where I'm headed next." "You don't have to have all the answers yet," Nathan said gently, his voice steady and calming. "The most important thing is that you're here. You're not lost anymore. You're choosing your path now, not anyone else's." His words struck a chord deep inside her, stirring something within that she hadn't realized was there. Choosing her path. It felt foreign, yet exhilarating. For so long, Claire's path had been dictated by Adrian, by the expectations of others, by a relationship that had drained her. But now, for the first time, she was standing at a crossroads of her own choosing, with no one else to answer to. She met Nathan's gaze, her eyes searching his. "And what about you, Nathan? What do you want?" He gave her a small, almost playful smile, as if considering the question carefully before answering. "What I want is for you to find happiness. Whatever that looks like for you. I want you to feel free, to be the woman you deserve to be." His sincerity was disarming, and for a moment, Claire found herself lost in the depth of his words. There was no judgment in his gaze, no expectation, only genuine care and affection. It was a contrast to everything she had endured, everything Adrian had never been able to give her. And suddenly, Claire felt the overwhelming need to respond. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For being here, for understanding me in ways I didn't even understand myself." Nathan's smile softened, his eyes darkening with something more intimate than mere friendship. "You don't have to thank me. You're my friend, Claire. I'll always be here for you." A warmth spread through Claire's chest as she looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She had been so caught up in the aftermath of Adrian's betrayal that she had failed to notice the quiet, unwavering presence Nathan had been all along. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He had simply been there, giving her space when she needed it, offering his support without reservation. And now, as their eyes met, Claire realized something else, something that had been brewing beneath the surface, unspoken but undeniable. She wasn't just grateful for Nathan. She was beginning to feel something deeper for him. Before she could fully process this new realization, the moment was interrupted by the sound of Claire's phone vibrating on the coffee table. She glanced at it, her heart immediately sinking as she saw the name on the screen. Adrian. Nathan, ever perceptive, noticed her reaction. He didn't say anything, but he gave her a small, knowing smile. Claire hesitated for a moment before answering the call. As she lifted the phone to her ear, her heart pounded in her chest, but she was no longer the same woman who had let Adrian control her life. She was stronger, more certain, and more prepared to stand her ground. "Claire?" Adrian's voice came through the phone, strained and urgent. "I've been thinking about what you said. And I want to make things right. I need you, Claire. I can't live without you." Claire closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. When she spoke, her voice was calm, but firm. "Adrian, it's too late for that. I've made my choice, and I'm not coming back to a life where I'm not valued." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and Claire could almost hear him scrambling for words. But she wasn't waiting for an apology, nor did she need him to beg. She had heard it all before. "I'm sorry, but I'm not your second choice anymore," Claire continued, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not anyone's backup. I'm moving forward, with or without you." With a final sigh, she ended the call, placing the phone back on the table. She looked at Nathan, her heart lighter than it had been in months. I'm done, she whispered, almost as if the weight of those words freed her from a past that had defined her for too long. Nathan didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He simply smiled, his eyes full of warmth and understanding. And in that moment, Claire realized that she was finally ready to embrace her future. Chapter 12, A Step Forward. Claire sat in the quiet of her apartment, the hum of the city outside barely reaching her ears. The call with Adrian had left her with a strange calmness, almost like she had finally closed a door that had been open far too long. As the seconds ticked by, she realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for something to change. She was here, in this moment, and for the first time, that was enough. Nathan sat beside her, not pushing her to speak but offering the kind of quiet company that made the silence feel safe. His presence, steady and unfailing, was a balm to the rawness of her emotions. He had been the one constant in her life when everything else had crumbled, the one person who hadn't turned away when she was at her lowest. And now, as she sat there, her heart a little lighter, her mind clearer, she realized how much that meant. You know, Nathan said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them, I've seen you struggle, Claire. I've seen how much you've carried for so long. But I want you to remember that you don't have to do it all alone anymore. Claire turned to look at him, his words soft but laden with an understanding that only someone who had truly seen her could have. I know, she said, her voice almost a whisper, but it's still hard to trust. Not just other people, but myself. I've let myself down so many times. Nathan's gaze softened, his hand moving to rest gently on her shoulder. You're not the same person you were, Claire. You've learned, you've grown. You're stronger than you think. Claire nodded, the weight of his words settling deep within her. But there was still a lingering uncertainty in her chest, a question that hadn't fully been answered. What now? She had taken the first step by ending things with Adrian, but the future felt uncertain, like a vast open space waiting to be filled with decisions she wasn't sure she was ready to make. I don't know what comes next, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I don't even know if I'm ready to move on from everything. Nathan squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, his voice low but steady. It's okay. You don't have to know everything right now. You don't need to have it all figured out. Just take it one step at a time. The comfort in his words felt like a lifeline, something she hadn't realized she needed so badly. She had spent so long being consumed by the past, by what had been, that she had forgotten that the future was hers to shape. One step at a time. It didn't have to be overwhelming. It didn't have to be perfect. It just had to be real. As Claire looked out the window, the city lights twinkling in the distance, something within her shifted. She was done living in the shadows of her past mistakes, done being defined by what had been done to her. She was ready to carve out a future where she was the one in control. And whether that future involved forgiveness, love, or simply learning to stand on her own 2 feet, Claire knew that she was no longer afraid of what came next. Nathan stood up after a moment, stretching his arms above his head. I should probably get going. You know, before you start thinking I'm getting too comfortable in your space, he teased lightly. Claire smiled at him, the warmth in her chest growing as she saw the easy camaraderie between them. You're welcome to stay, she said, her voice teasing but warm. But only if you promise not to raid my fridge. Nathan grinned. Deal, he said with a wink. But I'll hold you to that offer next time. As Nathan made his way toward the door, Claire's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. She wasn't sure what the next day would bring, but for the first time, she felt like she was finally stepping into the life she was meant to live. With a final smile and a quick wave, Nathan was gone, leaving Claire in the quiet of her apartment once again. She stood by the window for a long time, lost in her thoughts, the soft glow of the streetlights below illuminating her face. She wasn't alone anymore. Not in the sense she had feared. She had friends. She had herself. And that was enough. The next few days passed in a blur of small but significant moments. Claire revisited old passions she had long forgotten. She spent afternoons painting, her hands covered in vibrant strokes of color as she lost herself in the art. The canvases that had once sat untouched were now filled with new pieces, images of strength, of freedom, and of reclamation. But even as she rediscovered herself, the question of what now still lingered. One evening, as she walked through the city, her thoughts heavy, Claire bumped into an old acquaintance from her art school days. It was unexpected, yet strangely comforting. The woman, Lila, greeted her with a warm smile and they exchanged pleasantries before Claire was invited to a gallery opening that Lila was hosting. "Come," Lila urged, her eyes bright. "You've got talent, Claire. I've seen it. You should showcase your work again. Don't let it go to waste." At first, Claire hesitated. The thought of showcasing her work, putting herself out there again, felt daunting. But Lila's encouragement sparked something deep within her. Could she do it? Could she finally share her art with the world once more? As Claire pondered the invitation over the following days, she realized something. It wasn't just about the art. It was about showing the world who she was, about reclaiming her voice, her worth. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. Maybe it was time to start living for herself, without fear. The decision to attend the gallery opening wasn't easy, but Claire knew it was a step in the right direction. A step toward embracing all that she had to offer, despite the pain and uncertainty that had marked her past. And so, as the night of the gallery opening arrived, Claire found herself standing in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom, wearing a simple black dress, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't just an art show. It was her declaration. A declaration that she was more than what she had once been. With a deep breath, she took one last look at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was no longer the frightened, lost girl she had once been. She was someone who had survived, someone who had learned to stand tall again. And with that, Claire stepped out into the night, ready for whatever came next. Chapter 13, A New Beginning. The gallery was bustling with energy when Claire arrived. The walls were adorned with pieces that captured the chaotic beauty of the world, abstract splashes of color, portraits filled with raw emotion, and landscapes that seemed to hold entire stories within their brushstrokes. It was a celebration of art, but also of the people who had poured their souls into their creations. Claire lingered by the entrance, her nerves making her feel like an outsider despite the welcoming atmosphere. She hadn't been in a gallery for years, not since before everything had gone wrong. Before Adrian. Before the chaos of betrayal and heartbreak had swallowed her whole. It felt surreal to be standing in the midst of such creativity, her own art still an afterthought in her mind. But tonight, it wasn't about hiding anymore. It wasn't about pretending she didn't matter. It was about stepping forward, even if it felt like taking a giant leap into the unknown. Lila spotted her immediately, a wide smile spreading across her face. She waved Claire over enthusiastically. "You came," she exclaimed, her voice carrying a touch of excitement. "I knew you would." Claire smiled back, her nerves calming slightly under Lila's warmth. "Thanks for inviting me. This is amazing." She gestured around, taking in the vibrant energy of the room. "It's all you deserve and more," Lila said, her eyes twinkling with genuine admiration. "You've got a gift, Claire. Don't forget that." Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest at the words. She wasn't sure if she deserved the praise yet, but it felt good to hear, especially after so much self-doubt. It reminded her of who she had been before the storm. As they walked through the gallery, Claire found herself lingering at a few of the pieces that struck a chord with her. She admired the work of the other artists, recognizing the vulnerability and courage it took to lay bare their souls for the world to see. As much as she had feared this moment, she realized that there was beauty in the vulnerability, in the act of sharing something personal with others. Lila led her to a quiet corner of the gallery, where a small group of people had gathered around a particular piece, a collection of colorful landscapes and fragmented portraits that seemed to capture moments of both joy and sorrow. Claire's heart skipped when she realized the work belonged to her. "I wanted to showcase your work tonight," Lila said softly. "I know you've been hesitant, but your art deserves to be seen. This is just the beginning." Claire's breath caught in her throat. Seeing her own work displayed for the first time in years was overwhelming. Her paintings weren't just images on a canvas, they were pieces of herself, reflections of the darkness and light that had shaped her. They were fragments of the woman she had been and the woman she was becoming. The group gathered around the painting was discussing its depth and meaning, and Claire found herself listening intently. They saw something in her art that she had been blind to: the pain, the growth, the journey. It made her realize how far she had come. Her work wasn't just a reflection of her past, it was a testament to her resilience. Lila noticed Claire's quiet contemplation and leaned in, her voice gentle. "You're not just showing the world your art tonight, Claire. You're showing them who you are. And trust me, that's something powerful." Claire turned to Lila, a mixture of gratitude and disbelief in her eyes. "I don't know if I'm ready for this." "You don't have to be ready," Lila replied. "You just have to take the step. The rest will follow." But even as she tried to embrace the stillness, the silence of her own company, her past loomed in the background, casting long shadows. It was a constant reminder that, no matter how far she ran, it wasn't over. Adrian's message hadn't been the end of it. One rainy evening, as Claire sipped tea by the window, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped, a sharp pang in her chest. She didn't need to look through the peephole to know who it was. She knew that Adrian wouldn't just let her go, not after everything. With a deep breath, she stood up and opened the door. There he was. Adrian. His familiar, expensive cologne reached her before his words did, and his expression, conflicted, almost pained, made her stomach twist. He was standing there, drenched from the rain, his eyes searching hers with a desperation Claire hadn't seen before. "Claire," he said, his voice soft but firm, as if he had rehearsed the words over and over. "We need to talk." She didn't step aside. She didn't invite him in. Instead, she held her ground, the steady thrum of her heart reminding her that this was her life now, not his. "I don't want to talk to you, Adrian," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "Not anymore." His brows furrowed, a flicker of hurt crossing his face. "I know you're angry, but I didn't mean for it to be like this." His voice was strained, but Claire could hear the guilt in it, as though he was trying to reclaim some part of their history, trying to take back the years he had squandered. Her gaze was steady, unflinching. "No. You never meant for anything to be the way it was. You never thought about me, about us. You only thought about what you wanted." His lips parted as if to argue, but Claire held up a hand, silencing him. "You trusted everyone but me. Your white moonlight, your family, your friends, they were all more important than me, than what we were. So don't come here expecting me to fall into your arms, begging for your forgiveness. I'm not that person anymore." She could feel her chest tighten as the words left her lips. It was the truth. The bitter, painful truth she had to face. Adrian had been the center of her universe for so long. But now, he was a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. He had taken her love for granted, and now, all that was left was the remnants of a relationship that had been suffocating her for years. Adrian stood frozen, as though the force of her words had struck him speechless. His usual arrogance, that edge of entitlement that had been so familiar, seemed to melt away in the rain. For the first time in their relationship, Claire saw him for what he truly was, a man who had failed to see her, to understand her, and now stood before her, grasping at whatever remnants of control he could. "I was wrong," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I could live without you. But I can't. I miss you, Claire. I need you." Her heart twisted, but she quickly suppressed the emotions rising within her. "You don't need me. You need your image of me. The woman you could control, the one you could push aside when it suited you." The silence between them thickened, laden with all the unspoken words and regrets that had piled up over the years. For a moment, Claire considered his words. Could she forgive him? Was there any part of her that still wanted him in her life? But then the thought was gone. It was too late. "I've given you everything, Adrian," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "And you destroyed it. You don't get to come back and expect me to fix what's already broken." He opened his mouth to protest, but Claire stepped back, closing the door gently but firmly in his face. Her heart pounded in her chest, the adrenaline of the confrontation making her hands shake. She leaned against the door for a moment, breathing deeply, calming the storm of emotions raging inside her. This is the right thing, she reminded herself. I'm stronger now. I'm moving forward. The sound of footsteps receding from the door confirmed that Adrian had left. Claire's fingers gripped the doorframe, her chest heaving as the reality of the situation settled in. She had faced him. She had stood her ground. And now, she could finally close the door on that chapter of her life. When she turned around, Nathan was standing at the end of the hallway, having witnessed the entire exchange. His face was unreadable, but the warmth in his eyes was unmistakable. He didn't say anything, but the gentle nod he gave her spoke volumes. Claire didn't need words to understand. Nathan had always known how to support her without pushing her. Without asking for more than she was ready to give. I'm okay, Claire whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was reassuring more, herself or Nathan. Nathan smiled, walking toward her. He didn't need to say anything either. His presence was enough. And as the rain continued to fall outside, Claire felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. The past was behind her. Adrian was behind her. And for the first time in a long time, Claire knew she was finally free. Chapter 11, A New Beginning. The following days felt like a delicate balance between old memories and new possibilities. Claire spent much of her time at home, alone with her thoughts, sorting through the emotions that were still raw but slowly beginning to heal. Despite Adrian's intrusion at her doorstep, something within her had shifted. The anger that once consumed her now felt like a distant memory. Instead, there was an undeniable sense of relief, as though an invisible weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She spent hours reflecting, not on what Adrian had taken from her, but on what she was reclaiming for herself. The vibrant colors of her paintings, the forgotten melodies she used to hum in the kitchen, the books she'd once loved but abandoned, all of these were pieces of herself she had let go in favor of a love that was never truly hers to begin with. That night, as Claire sat by the window, watching the city lights twinkle through the mist of a gentle rain, Nathan arrived at her door. He had been her anchor in these turbulent times, offering her quiet reassurance and unwavering support. He didn't pry, didn't push her to talk when she wasn't ready, but today, Claire could see something new in his eyes, something more personal, something deeper. Hey, Nathan greeted softly, his voice laced with warmth. He stepped into her apartment, pausing as he noticed the open sketchbook on the coffee table and the empty teacup beside it. I didn't want to interrupt your peace. Claire smiled faintly, the same warmth radiating in her chest whenever he was near. You're not interrupting, she said. In fact, I'm glad you're here. I was just thinking. Nathan sat down beside her, offering her a small smile before glancing out the window. The rain had subsided, leaving behind a quiet serenity that matched the stillness inside her. He didn't press her to explain, he just let the silence speak between them, knowing how comforting it was to share a moment without the need for words. How are you doing? He asked after a beat, his gaze turning to her, concern evident in his eyes. Claire hesitated, letting the question settle before she answered. It's strange, she admitted, looking down at her hands. I feel like I'm finally breathing, but at the same time, there's this emptiness I don't know how to fill. It's like I'm free, but I don't know what to do with that freedom. As the evening wore on, Claire felt a subtle shift within her. The nerves that had initially gripped her were slowly replaced by a sense of peace, a deep, grounding awareness that she was finally moving towards something that was hers, something that wasn't defined by the people who had once controlled her story. She was writing her own now, one brushstroke at a time. She spent the rest of the night speaking with other artists, learning about their creative processes, and sharing her own experiences. There was an unexpected joy in connecting with people who understood the vulnerability of art, and the mutual respect between them was evident. For the first time, Claire didn't feel like an imposter. She felt like an artist, like she belonged. As the gallery started to wind down, Lila came over again, a playful smile on her lips. How does it feel? She asked. It's incredible, Claire admitted, her voice a little shaky but filled with awe. I didn't expect to feel this way. I thought I'd be terrified the whole time. You didn't come here to be terrified, Lila said, her tone soft but confident. You came here because you've earned the right to be seen. Claire's heart swelled with a mixture of emotions, but there was one thing she knew for sure, this was just the beginning. She wasn't sure where the path would lead, but for the first time, she felt ready to walk it. As the night came to an end and Claire stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of the past few years felt lighter. She wasn't defined by her mistakes anymore. She wasn't defined by the people who had hurt her. She was defined by the woman she was becoming. A woman who was ready to reclaim her life, her art, and her future. And with each step she took into the night, Claire knew she was leaving behind the girl who had once been too afraid to move forward. The woman walking now was someone who understood her own worth. And nothing, not even the shadow of her past, could take that away from her. Chapter 14, Embracing the Future. The crisp night air greeted Claire as she stepped out of the gallery, the hum of the city's nightlife filling the space around her. The sound of distant conversations, the occasional honking of car horns, and the soft shuffle of footsteps against the sidewalk felt strangely comforting. It was as if the world was moving on, and she, too, was beginning to feel like she belonged in it again. Claire glanced up at the sky, the moon shining brightly through the veil of city lights. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a spark of hope. There was a sense of possibility now, a belief that everything she had gone through, every wound and scar, had led her to this moment. Her future, her art, and the woman she was becoming weren't defined by the people who had tried to control her. It was her own journey now. As she made her way to the small cafe down the street, a familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Claire. She froze. That voice. That voice she had spent years running from. It sent a chill down her spine, but it was not a chill of fear. It was a chill of recognition. She slowly turned to face the source of the voice, her heart racing in her chest. Standing there, under the dim glow of a street lamp, was Ethan. Her breath hitched in her throat, and for a moment, everything around her seemed to blur. The air, the city, the sounds, they all faded into a quiet hum. She could only focus on him, the man who had once been her world, the man who had crushed her heart and shattered her trust. Ethan's appearance was just as she remembered, tall, dark-haired, his eyes sharp with intelligence and coldness that once captivated her. He looked the same, but there was something different about him now. He wasn't the man she remembered. Or at least, he wasn't the man she had known. Claire, he repeated, his voice softer now, tinged with something, regret? Guilt? She couldn't quite place it. She took a step back, her defenses immediately rising. What are you doing here, Ethan? She asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. He paused, his gaze lowering to the ground before lifting back to meet hers. I've been looking for you. For a while now. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken history. Claire felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had spent so many nights reliving their past, wondering what it would be like if she saw him again. And now that the moment had arrived, she realized one thing, she wasn't the same person who had once loved him unconditionally. I don't think I need to hear your reasons, Ethan, she said calmly, her voice betraying none of the emotion she was struggling to suppress. You made your choice. You trusted someone else over me. And I've moved on. Ethan's face tightened, his jaw clenching. I know I hurt you, he said quietly, taking a step toward her. I made a mistake. A huge one. But I need you to understand something, Claire. I never stopped caring about you. Claire took another step back, her resolve hardening. I'm not here for an apology. And I'm not here to relive the past. Her eyes held his, unwavering. I've spent years fighting to get to this point, to heal. And I won't let you drag me back into your mess. Ethan's eyes flickered with something, pain, desperation, perhaps even regret. You think I don't know what I've done, he asked, his voice almost pleading now. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was protecting you, Claire. Claire shook her head, her heart pounding. You weren't protecting me, Ethan. You were using me. You thought I'd be there, no matter what, and when you thought you'd lost me, you turned to someone else. You hurt me, and I've been healing. And I'm done. She turned away, not giving him a chance to respond. Goodbye. But just as she took a few steps, Ethan's voice stopped her again. Claire, please. The desperation in his tone made her hesitate, just for a moment. She turned back, her heart racing in her chest. What more do you want from me, Ethan? She asked, the bitterness in her voice rising. What more can you possibly say to make this better? You had your chance. You had your chance to choose me. I know, he said, his voice breaking. And I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I'm asking, for once, for you to trust me again. Just give me a chance to prove that I've changed. Claire stared at him, her mind swirling with a mix of old feelings and newfound strength. She wanted to believe him. Part of her, the part that had loved him so deeply, wanted to forgive him and pretend that everything could go back to the way it had been. But another part of her, the stronger part, knew better. She had built a life without him. She had built herself back up from the ashes of their broken relationship. You want me to trust you? Claire's voice was low, almost a whisper, but filled with finality. You've already proven who you are to me, Ethan. And I'm not that girl anymore. I'm not the girl who waits for someone to change. I'm the woman who walks away when it's time. And it's time. With that, she turned away from him for the last time. She could feel his eyes on her as she walked down the street, but this time, there was no fear in her. No hesitation. Only the steady rhythm of her own footsteps, carrying her forward into the life she had built. And as she disappeared into the night, Claire knew she had done the right thing. She had taken the step that would allow her to embrace the future, a future that didn't include Ethan, a future where she was no longer bound by the chains of a past that had tried to break her. For the first time in years, Claire felt truly free. Chapter 15, The Weight of Letting Go. Claire walked with purpose, the sound of her shoes clicking on the pavement echoing in the quiet of the night. She didn't look back. Not once. It wasn't because she was too afraid to face Ethan. No, it was because she knew that if she did, she might still be tempted by the ghost of the past. The past that was now behind her, where it belonged. Her steps led her to a quiet park, a place she had frequented during the darker times in her life. The same park where she had sat countless nights, staring at the stars, questioning her worth, questioning her future. It was strange, almost poetic, that she had found herself here again, this time not lost, but found. Claire paused at the edge of the park, looking up at the sky. The stars sparkled against the deep indigo of the night, distant and untouchable. It reminded her of how small she once felt, how invisible she had allowed herself to become in the presence of others. But now, standing here, she realized just how far she had come. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her from her thoughts. She reached for it, expecting to see another message from Lila, perhaps checking in on how the gallery event had gone. But instead, it was a message from her sister, Grace. I heard from Ethan. I think you should talk to him. He's really sorry, Claire. He's been asking around, trying to find out where you are. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she read the words. The familiar ache of old wounds resurfaced, but it was quickly followed by a sense of peace. She didn't need Ethan's apology. She didn't need his validation anymore. It wasn't about him, it never had been. It was about her, about finding her own strength, reclaiming her own life. She typed a quick reply, I've heard everything I need to hear. I don't want to revisit the past. And then she put the phone back in her pocket, her fingers lingering over the screen for just a moment longer. She didn't owe anyone an explanation. Not anymore. Claire sat on the bench under the old oak tree, its gnarled branches swaying gently in the breeze. She closed her eyes, letting the cool air wash over her. It had been a long time since she had felt this calm, this centered. The night was quiet, save for the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of city traffic. It was in this silence that Claire felt the weight of the last few years lift from her shoulders. All the anger, all the resentment, it had melted away, leaving room for something new. In the stillness, she let herself reflect. She had spent so long clinging to what she couldn't change, unable to see that her happiness didn't depend on anyone else. Not Ethan, not her past. She had always had the power to move forward. And tonight, she was moving forward. As if the universe itself had conspired to remind her of this, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from Lila. "I've got a surprise for you tomorrow. I hope you're ready." A smile tugged at the corners of Claire's lips. Lila had a way of keeping things interesting, always ready with a plan, always pushing Claire to embrace her next chapter. Claire glanced at the sky once more, her heart swelling with the certainty that she was on the right path. She didn't know what the future held, but she no longer feared it. For the first time, the unknown felt like an opportunity rather than a threat. The evening passed quietly, and when Claire finally returned home, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. The apartment felt different now, calmer, more like her own space. She had cleaned it out in the last few weeks, purging herself of remnants of her old life, old photos, letters from the past, things that once held meaning but now only reminded her of what had been. Her life was no longer defined by the people who had tried to make her into someone else. It was hers, entirely hers, and she was learning to live it on her own terms. Claire took a deep breath as she entered her bedroom, glancing at the painting she had been working on for the past few days. It was still unfinished, but it had become her most personal work to date. The colors were bold, the brushstrokes aggressive but purposeful. There was something raw in it, something that felt like the release of years of pent-up emotion. She had poured herself into this painting, every ounce of pain, every bit of growth, and every ounce of strength. She walked over to the canvas, her fingers lightly brushing the textured surface. There was a sense of finality in it. Not just in the painting, but in her life. She wasn't going to keep holding on to the past, hoping it would make things better. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to give her permission to be happy. Claire was already happy. And she was ready to keep moving forward, one brushstroke at a time. As she stepped back from the canvas, she knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. Not to find someone else to complete her, but to complete herself. To embrace her own journey, her own creativity, and her own future. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. But tonight? Tonight was hers. And for the first time in a long time, Claire felt truly at peace. Chapter 16, Shadows of the Past. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing Claire's modest apartment in a warm glow. It felt surreal how peaceful mornings had become for her, free from the weight of living under someone else's expectations. She tied her hair back into a loose ponytail and sipped her tea, staring at the painting she had finished the night before. It was different from anything she had ever created before, a mixture of dark hues and bursts of vibrant color, like light fighting its way through a storm. The jagged strokes and chaotic blending seemed to tell a story of struggle, survival, and eventual triumph. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. Her phone buzzed, jolting her from her thoughts. She hesitated before picking it up. Messages from Grace or Ethan were the last thing she wanted to deal with. But when she saw Lila's name on the screen, a smile crept onto her face. "Meet me at the Velvet Brush at noon. Wear something nice." The Velvet Brush was a gallery Claire often visited, not just for inspiration but also to dream of one day showcasing her own work there. Lila's vague messages usually meant something exciting was in store, and Claire couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. By noon, Claire found herself standing in front of the gallery. The Velvet Brush's glass doors reflected the bustling street behind her, but her eyes were fixed on the interior. Inside, bright white walls adorned with vivid paintings gave the space an air of creativity and elegance. The familiar smell of paint and varnish filled the air as she stepped inside. Lila was waiting near the entrance, looking as vibrant as ever in a deep green dress that contrasted with her auburn curls. She waved enthusiastically as Claire entered, her grin widening when she saw her friend. "Finally!" Lila exclaimed, grabbing Claire's hand and dragging her toward the back of the gallery. "You're late." "I'm not late," Claire said, laughing. "You're just ridiculously early." Details, Lila dismissed with a wave. "Now, brace yourself. Claire raised an eyebrow, curiosity growing as they approached a section of the gallery she hadn't been to before. A few familiar faces from the local art scene were milling about, their eyes focused on the displays. Claire followed their gaze, and froze. There, on the pristine white wall, hung her painting. The one she had completed just last night. Lila, Claire's voice was barely a whisper. What did you do? Lila beamed, clearly proud of herself. You've been hiding your talent for too long. I might have called in a few favors. Claire stared at the painting, her emotions a whirlwind of shock, gratitude, and nervousness. It looked different here, surrounded by the works of other established artists. But somehow, it held its own. Before she could respond, a tall man with salt and pepper hair approached them. His tailored suit and confident demeanor gave him an air of authority. You must be Claire, he said, extending a hand. I'm Martin Fields, the curator here. Lila's been singing your praises non-stop. I must say, your work is remarkable. Thank you, Claire said, shaking his hand, her voice still trembling with disbelief. We'd like to feature your piece in our upcoming exhibit, Martin continued. And if you're interested, I'd love to discuss the possibility of showcasing more of your work in the future. Claire's heart soared. She had dreamed of this moment for years but never dared to believe it could actually happen. I'd love that, she managed to say, her voice steadier now. Lila nudged her with a grin. Told you you're amazing. Later that evening, Claire sat on her balcony, the city lights twinkling like stars below her. She cradled a cup of tea in her hands, reflecting on the day's events. Her painting, hanging in one of the most prestigious galleries in the city, it still didn't feel real. Her phone buzzed again, breaking her reverie. She picked it up, expecting another message from Lila. But this time, it was Ethan. Claire, I know I don't deserve your time, but please, can we talk? Just once. I need to apologize. Properly. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she read and reread the message. For years, she had craved these words from him. But now that they were here, they felt empty. The closure she thought she needed had already come from within herself, not from him. She sighed, setting the phone aside without replying. Ethan's regret was his burden to bear, not hers. Tonight wasn't about the past. It was about the future, a future she was finally ready to embrace, free from the shadows of the life she had left behind. Claire leaned back in her chair, a small smile playing on her lips as she stared at the stars. For the first time in years, they didn't feel distant or untouchable. They felt close, as if they were shining just for her. Chapter 16, Continuation. A New Dawn. The air on the balcony was cool and crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from a neighbor's garden below. Claire sipped her tea, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the city lights blurred into the dark sky. The glow of her phone dimmed as Ethan's message faded from the screen, leaving her with the weight of the moment. She had spent years yearning for this, an apology, acknowledgement, anything that validated her pain. Yet now that it was in her grasp, it felt hollow. Ethan's words couldn't erase the years of cruelty, nor could they undo the damage caused by his blind trust in Grace and his own hubris. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz. This time, it was Lila again. Hey, superstar, don't forget, interview with the gallery tomorrow morning. Proud of you. Claire smiled, her heart warming at her friend's unwavering support. Lila had been her anchor, the person who had encouraged her to reclaim her identity and dreams when she'd felt like giving up entirely. Setting the phone down, Claire resolved to focus on her new beginning. Tonight was about celebrating her victory, not revisiting old wounds. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the window, pulling Claire from her sleep. The vibrant hues of the sunrise seemed to mirror her emotions, hopeful, bright, and full of promise. She dressed with care, choosing a simple yet elegant outfit that reflected her confidence. A black blazer paired with a soft cream blouse and tailored trousers, it was a look that exuded professionalism and grace. At the gallery, Martin greeted her warmly, his excitement palpable as he introduced her to a local journalist covering the upcoming exhibit. The interview was a whirlwind of questions about her creative process, inspirations, and future plans. As she spoke, Claire felt a sense of pride she hadn't experienced in years. Her words flowed effortlessly, each one reaffirming her passion for art and the life she was building. That evening, Claire attended the gallery's private preview event. The space buzzed with energy as artists, critics, and patrons mingled, sipping champagne and discussing the pieces on display. Claire's painting hung prominently among the collection, drawing admiration and thoughtful conversation from those who stopped to admire it. Lila appeared by her side, a glass of champagne in hand. "They love your work," she said, her eyes sparkling with pride. "I overheard someone calling it the highlight of the exhibit." Claire chuckled, her cheeks flushing with a mix of pride and modesty. "It still feels surreal." Lila nudged her playfully. "Get used to it, superstar." Their laughter was interrupted by a familiar voice. "Claire." She turned to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He looked out of place among the lively crowd, his suit immaculate but his demeanor subdued. For a moment, the gallery's noise seemed to fade, leaving only the two of them. "I didn't expect to see you here," Claire said, her voice calm but firm. "I heard about your exhibit," Ethan replied, his gaze flickering to the painting behind her. "It's beautiful. You're talented, Claire. I should have realized that sooner." Claire's lips curved into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's ironic, isn't it? You only see my worth after you've lost me." Ethan winced but didn't look away. "I made so many mistakes. I let Grace manipulate me, and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to apologize for. I was blind and selfish, and I lost the best thing that ever happened to me." Claire studied him for a moment, her heart steady. "You're right. You did lose me. And I lost years of my life waiting for you to see me, to love me the way I deserved. But those years are gone now, Ethan. I can't get them back, and neither can you." He stepped closer, desperation flickering in his eyes. "Please, Claire. I know I don't deserve it, but if there's any chance." "There isn't," she said gently but firmly. "Ethan, I've moved on. This is my life now, a life I built without you, a life where I found my strength and my voice. I hope you find peace, but I can't give that to you. It's something you'll have to find on your own." Ethan's shoulders slumped as the weight of her words sank in. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her one last time before he turned and walked away. Claire watched him go, a sense of finality settling over her. It wasn't sadness she felt, but relief. This chapter of her life was finally closed, leaving her free to embrace the future. Later that night, as the gallery emptied and the city settled into its quiet rhythm, Claire stood alone before her painting. She traced the strokes with her eyes, each one a testament to her journey, her pain, her healing, and her triumph. For the first time in years, she felt whole. The past no longer held her captive. She had reclaimed her life, her dreams, and her happiness. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, she knew this was just the beginning of her story, a story she would write on her own terms, with every stroke of her brush and every beat of her heart. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, as if celebrating her newfound freedom. And Claire, with her head held high and a smile on her lips, walked into the future with unwavering confidence. Final chapter, a canvas of new beginnings. The gallery lights dimmed as the last guests trickled out, leaving Claire surrounded by her creations. The vibrant colors of her paintings seemed to glow softly under the warm lighting, each piece telling a fragment of her story, a journey of pain, resilience, and triumph. The once shattered fragments of her heart now stood as vivid brushstrokes on canvas, eternal and unbreakable. Lila approached with a playful smile and a glass of champagne. "So, how does it feel to be the talk of the art world, Miss Superstar?" Claire laughed softly, taking the glass. "It feels right. Like I'm finally where I'm supposed to be." The two clinked glasses, their laughter mingling with the faint echoes of music still playing softly in the gallery. Lila glanced at Claire's painting and said, "You know, the piece about the sunrise? It's my favorite. It feels like you're telling the world, I survived." Claire nodded, her gaze lingering on the painting. "It's more than that, Lila. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving. An unexpected visitor. As they spoke, Claire noticed a shadowy figure lingering near the entrance. Her smile faded slightly as she recognized Ethan. He hesitated, then stepped inside, looking around with an air of uncertainty. He carried a small box, its corners worn as though he had held onto it for some time. Lila gave Claire a questioning look, but Claire shook her head gently. "I'll handle it." Ethan approached slowly, his steps cautious, like a man approaching a fragile dream. "Claire," he began, his voice soft and tinged with regret. I didn't mean to interrupt." Claire's gaze was steady, her expression calm but unreadable. "What are you doing here, Ethan?" He held out the box, his hands trembling slightly. "I wanted to give you this. It's everything I should have said. Everything I should have done differently." Claire hesitated, then took the box and opened it. Inside was a collection of letters, all addressed to her, dated over the last year. She skimmed one, her name written in shaky handwriting followed by pages of apologies and confessions. "I know it's too late," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted you to know. I'm sorry. For everything." Claire closed the box and looked up at him. "Thank you, Ethan. For saying what you needed to say. But these words don't change the past, and they can't rebuild what's been broken. I've moved on, and I hope you find peace someday." Ethan's shoulders sagged as he absorbed her words. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but instead, he nodded. "I understand. Goodbye, Claire." "Goodbye, Ethan," she replied, her voice firm yet kind. As he walked away, the weight of the past seemed to lift, leaving only a sense of finality. Claire turned to Lila, who gave her a proud smile. "That was brave," Lila said. Claire shrugged lightly, a small smile tugging at her lips. "It wasn't bravery, Lila. It was closure. The future awaits." The next morning, Claire woke early, sunlight streaming through her window. She made her way to her studio, where blank canvases awaited her. With a deep breath, she dipped her brush into a palette of vibrant colors and began painting, her strokes bold and confident. Her phone buzzed on the table, a message from Martin about a new international exhibit opportunity. Claire smiled, feeling a surge of excitement. The world was opening up to her, and she was ready to embrace it. Later that evening, she stood on her balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The city lights began to twinkle, a reflection of her own journey, darkness giving way to light. For the first time in years, her heart felt free. As she sipped her tea, she thought of the person she had become. She wasn't the woman who had bowed her head and accepted blame for someone else's cruelty. She wasn't the woman who waited for love that was never returned. She was Claire, an artist, a survivor, and a dreamer. And this was just the beginning. With the stars shining brightly above, Claire made a promise to herself: her story would no longer be written by others. It would be painted in vibrant hues, each stroke a testament to her strength and resilience. The night embraced her like an old friend, and Claire smiled, ready to step boldly into the life she had fought so hard to create. The story concludes with Claire standing tall in the gallery of her life, surrounded by the fruits of her resilience and creativity. She has shed the chains of her past, turning pain into power and loss into art. The final image is of Claire, bathed in the warm glow of the setting sun, a brush in her hand and a smile on her face. She is no longer defined by the actions of others but by her own choices and dreams. The world ahead is vast, full of possibility, and she is ready to embrace it, one bold stroke at a time. Her journey is complete, not because the challenges have ended, but because she has found the strength within herself to face whatever comes next. This is Claire's story, a tale of renewal, redemption, and the triumph of the human spirit. The end.